Hey guys, and welcome back. In this video, I wanted to go over the results that we saw in the Senate here in the midterms, and definitely a better than expected result from the Republicans. And what a lot of people undervalued, including myself, is the positive effect that the president had going on in campaigning in a lot of these different states where he was able to beat Hillary Clinton back in 2016 by significant margins. In those areas, he definitely had a factor in getting these Republicans over the line against a lot of more moderate incumbent establishment Democrats. So going to go through a lot of the results here and talk more specifically about these competitive races. So first we'll take a look at the ones that are key states. There was two where Democrats were favored, two where Republicans were favored, and then we'll also take a look at the toss-up races in the middle. Starting off with the Democratic favored races. Not a big surprise here, for me anyways. Tina Smith, I never thought she was in any serious danger. She went on to win over double digits in that matchup. This is Al Franken's old seat in that special election. I'm not exactly sure why a lot of the models had this as being maybe a competitive matchup, especially when you look at Minnesota. They had very strong Democratic voter turnout back during the primaries. That's carried over here into the general election. Klobuchar winning by a landslide, and then a lot of her voters also going down ballot there and helping out Tina Smith win that one. West Virginia, an extremely Trump-heavy state. He won it by over 40 points. And Trump, he did a lot of work in West Virginia to try to flip this one over. But this is one state where Trump did very well, but his Republican candidate that he was supporting wasn't able to get over the line. Manchin holding on to this one by about 3 percentage points, which is significantly worse than what he did last time around. 6 years ago in 2012, he won by over 20 points. So definitely a reduction in the margin of victory here for Manchin, but he was able to hold off the surge that Trump was able to have positively for a lot of these Republican candidates in other states that he did well in. West Virginia, it just wasn't quite enough to get him over the line. And just talking about some other Democratic results before going over to the Republican side, the Democrats actually did fairly well within the Midwest, minus Missouri and Indiana, but holding Wisconsin, winning that one by about 10 points, Michigan by about 5 or 6 points, Ohio by about 7 points, Pennsylvania by over double digits as well, and then also going down a little bit to the south there in Virginia, Tim Kaine winning in convincing fashion here by about 16 points, also going over to New Jersey. Menendez, not the most popular guy by any means, but winning right around by about 10 percentage points. And these are contests that the Democrats were obviously expected to win, and just given the map overall in the Senate where they underperformed, you could say in a lot of these matchups, that wasn't the case in this kind of blue wall here within the Rust Belt, minus Indiana more specifically. So now going over to the Republican-favored matchups where they were able to come through, and that being North Dakota, the flip there with Cramer winning by about 10 percentage points. But then also looking down in Mississippi, it's going to go to a runoff. Hyde Smith was able to get the majority of the vote here, the Democrat Mike Espy. Not too far behind, but there was also a Republican that got third place in that election. You'd expect that Republican vote to consolidate a bit, and Espy is going to have himself an uphill battle there. So expect that one to go for the Republicans as well in the state of Mississippi. And now getting to the thick of it here, the toss-up races. This is where Democrats didn't do as well as they were hoping. It was always going to be a tough Senate map coming into these midterms, given the fact that they were defending 26 seats compared to the Republicans, who were defending 9. But given the national landscape as a whole, those generic congressional ballots, the voter enthusiasm, many thought that the Democrats wouldn't be able to not only hold all of these incumbencies that they had, but also maybe pick up some surprises here and there and maybe even get to a majority. That wasn't the case. That fell well short of that. The House kind of went as expected, but the Senate worse than expected here for the Democrats, just given the prognostication coming into the night. So we'll start off in the East and then work our way west. The earlier result that we got, Mike Braun did very well against Joe Donnelly. If I go back to my first prediction, this is the incumbent Democrat that I thought was going to have the tougher time coming through here, as well as Heitkamp. I kind of switched my feeling on that one over time because the polling data was getting more positive for Donnelly in the months coming up to the election. I thought maybe he had turned a corner, but I think what really hurt Donnelly in particular, those ads that he released just were very brutal against the base of voters that he needed to turn out with enthusiasm to get him over the line. and he took his voters for granted in the Democratic base of his party. And I think that was kind of the case in a lot of these areas where these centrist Democrats, some call them Republican light Democrats, trying to win Republican voters more than their own voters, and that just wasn't a winning strategy for these incumbent Democrats, Joe Donnelly. Especially on the Republican side, for instance, what we saw with them is there wasn't this effort to try to win over Democratic voters or even moderate independents. It was getting that Trump base enthusiastic about showing up and voting. And by going to their base and riling them up, they had a lot of success in increasing voter turnout for the Republicans more than was expected coming in to the night, certainly, and that's why they had more success. So then going down to Tennessee, very early on, Bredesen was looking strong in the polls, consistently slightly ahead against Blackburn. And I think looking back on it now in hindsight, that was probably because Bredesen had tremendous name recognition as being the popular former governor of the state in comparison to Blackburn. But in the months coming up to the election, as Blackburn got more name recognition, she started doing better in the polls and then finally getting ahead in the polls. And then that kind of carried over here into Election Day as she went on to win by actually a pretty convincing margin here. Tennessee, a very Republican state, and at the end of the day, that obviously helped Blackburn, but Trump coming in and helping as well was also able to push her over the line in what many thought was going to be a very close race, me included. I thought Bredesen had a really good shot here. He's above water in terms of his favorability in the state. He's won statewide elections before, but he wasn't able to carry that here in 2018. And I think Donald Trump had a big positive effect here with Blackburn in a state where he was able to do very well back in 2016. Perhaps a slightly surprising result here in Florida. The incumbent Bill Nelson looks like he's going to come up just short. It actually hasn't been decided yet. It's within about 0.4 percentage points. But Rick Scott, again, I think another situation where Donald Trump was able to have a positive effect. Trump winning Florida over Hillary Clinton. A lot of these areas where he was able to go in and campaign, he had a positive effect. Also, Rick Scott, what helps him here is that overwhelming name recognition as being the governor of the state. I think that also played a pretty big role here. Bill Nelson, he has the name recognition as well. And if he would have just gone against just your run-of-the-mill Republican candidate who doesn't have overwhelming name recognition, I think he probably would have been able to pull it out, having that incumbency advantage. But it's almost like his incumbency advantage was completely neutralized going against Rick Scott. And it was extremely close at the end of the day, but it looks like Rick Scott's going to go on and flip this one here for the Republicans. And then Missouri, kind of a similar situation to Indiana. It was a little bit closer, but still Josh Hawley going on and taking this one by about 6 percentage points. And again, Claire McCaskill, very similar in that Joe Donnelly fashion, where I think she kind of took her voting base for granted and tried to play more for picking up moderate Republican voters. And that strategy just simply did not work in these very Republican states, as we're seeing. And maybe that's what the Democrats can take out of this midterm elections in the Senate is you have to play to your base and rile them up and get that voter turnout. You can't rely on flipping Republicans in this day and age and in this political climate to try to carry you over the line. It's just not a coalition of voters that's looking like it's going to work for the Democrats in these red states going into the future. So we'll see if they change their strategy or not. And then again, North Dakota, kind of a similar vein to Missouri and Indiana. Heitkamp coming up well short. They're losing by about 10 percentage points. And again, another voter. And maybe that Democratic base isn't in the state of North Dakota where you could rile them up and have an impact in terms of strong enough voter turnout amongst that block of voters to carry a Democrat over the line in a state like North Dakota. And then also moving down to Nebraska, wasn't expected to be extremely close, and the Republicans were able to hold that one by about 20 percentage points. Now moving down to what was a big disappointment for the Democrats and the fact that they weren't able to pick up this monumental upset in the state of Texas. It was extremely close all night, but Ted Cruz was able to eke it out in the end, winning by right around 2 to 3 percentage points. So much closer, obviously, than the typical election that you get in Texas. And O'Rourke getting over 4 million votes in a midterm and a statewide election in Texas is absolutely absurd and unheard of. And what I think the Democrats did in Texas differently than some of these other results that I think is perhaps a game plan for them going into the future. He did not have the issue of making the Democratic base excited to turn out and also getting unlikely voters to come out and cast a ballot for him as well. Much closer race for him in Texas than we saw with these milquetoast centrist Democrats in North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana, and Tennessee, for instance, where they performed much worse than expected. I just don't think that they got the base as excited to show up and vote as O'Rourke was able to do in Texas. But it's also an issue with Ted Cruz as not being the most effective incumbent by any means. There's a lot of Republicans that also aren't a huge fan of Ted Cruz, which also played a factor in that one. All right, now moving over to Montana, and this is another very Trump state where the Democrats were actually able to hold on, much similar to a West Virginia scenario. So John Tester, he's ahead by about 1 percentage point, and it looks like he is going to go on and take this one over Matt Rosendale. A lot of that Tester vote came in later, and that allowed him to pick up ground and overtake Rosendale at the end of the day. Perhaps if Breckenridge, the Libertarian, wasn't in this one, that would have been able to make a difference for Matt Rosendale. But I'm not the kind of person who downgrades or is going to vote shame people that decide to cast a ballot for a third party, because at the end of the day, you don't know who they would vote for otherwise, or if they would have even showed up and voted if the person that they wanted to vote for wasn't on the ballot. And a similar thing can be said about Arizona, where the Green Party candidate, Angela Green, probably took votes away from Krysten Sinema, but again, maybe these people wouldn't have even turned out anyways, because Sinema, not all that different from Martha McSally at the end of the day in terms of their policy differences, a very centrist Republican-leaning type Democrat, and Sinema looked like she's probably going to come up just short here. She's down by about 16,000 votes with 99% reporting. Hasn't been called yet, but you'd definitely rather be in McSally's position right now than Sinema, and maybe the Green Party candidate having an effect there, but we'll never know how that would have played out. Otherwise, a disappointing loss here for the Democrats in the state of Arizona. They thought that this was a decent shot for them to flip. Even though this was a state that went for Donald Trump in 2016, it was fairly competitive between Trump and Clinton. They ran a very centrist, again, one of these centrist type Democrats that did not perform well. And it seems pretty much across the board that those type of candidates underperformed expectations. We'll see how that strategy maybe changes for the Democrats going into the future, maybe trying to get more candidates in the vein of a Beto O'Rourke, who overperformed slightly expectations otherwise. And then moving over to Nevada, this is the one pickup that the Democrats were able to take. They thought it was their best shot. And coming into the election day, or just before then, we had all of these models from these different outlets on which races were going to be competitive, which ones weren't. And actually, a lot of them maybe were giving a little bit to Dean Heller. I think that was a little bit overzealous there for the incumbent. We saw kind of across the board these models that were giving incumbents advantages, and those just didn't seem to play out by and large. It's more the states that had a Democratic lean, like Nevada, went for the Democrats. The states that have Republican lean largely went for the Republicans, minus Montana and West Virginia, for instance. But that's kind of the takeaway from this night. It seems like the days where you can have a centrist Democrat winning in Republican states in the Senate might be over. And then also on the flip side of that, these areas that generally go Democratic in presidential elections were able to defend a lot of their Senate seats otherwise. So it seems like these Senate races are becoming a bit more nationalized. And, you know, going into the future, we'll see how that plays a factor going into 2020, maybe adjusting some of those models and maybe reducing some of this incumbency advantage that wasn't able to help a lot of these Democrats in these key Republican states that they were trying to hold on to this. So that's pretty much going to wrap up this video, guys. I wanted to go over a lot of these competitive races, and particularly in the Senate, the Democrats didn't have as good of a night as they were hoping for. It probably would have been much worse if Hillary Clinton was the president, for instance, and they didn't have that Democratic voter enthusiasm. And a big difference maker here for the Republicans was Trump getting his base very enthusiastic about this midterm elections and able to show up in these states that were very important to him in winning, or at least states where he was able to do very well. I will say that particularly states that were extremely important for Trump to win the presidency in 2016, they weren't able to come through and flip those seats in particular, those being states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The blue wall held in that Rust Belt region, and we'll see how that plays out as we go towards 2020. In that presidential election, if the Democrats are able to flip some of those states back. So that's going to wrap up this video, guys. Thanks for stopping on in. Subscribe for more, and I hope to see you back here for future videos.